I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Eli Lake, Bloomberg View. Eli, with his colleague Josh Rogan, very carefully watching the suspect's secret nuclear weapons program negotiation in Switzerland, and the man to watch. This is very much like a sports contest. You have to know the coaches, you have to know the major players, and in this instance, this is a coach and a player. His name is Mohammed Javad Zarif. He is 54 years old. He's an Iranian diplomat, but that just begins to describe the effectiveness of Zarif in these negotiations and in the past and going forward in perpetuity. Eli, a very good evening to you. You write most carefully and presciently about Mr. Zarif yesterday, 24 hours ago, before these announcements today. What are important things to watch about Zarif, how he conducts himself, what he's doing even tonight after these statements from the White House? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you. Well, Zarif is a very, very slippery character, and he is the foreign minister of Iran, but he is really somebody who has been cultivating relationships with U.S. policy elites really, you could say for 30 years if you count his grad school career, but at least for 20 years since he's been a senior diplomat from Iran. And he's developed a kind of camaraderie. He's made himself accessible to journalists, to the policy analysts who go in and out of government, to members of Congress, and he has a story to tell. His narrative is that Iran has a right to enrich uranium, that everything about its program is peaceful, that Iran would never make nuclear weapons, and that it is already unreasonably asked to meet an excessive standard which is unwarranted, and they bend over backwards anyway, and that the sanctions against this country are unfair and unjust. That's typical fare for most diplomats from rogue states. But the difference with Zarif, and this is really important, is that he has a PhD in international relations. He understands international law. He's written scholarly on the topic. And so when he's dealing with diplomats, and this is the world in which they live, most of these diplomats, when they have to deal with some North Korean, zombie robot or someone else from a rogue state, just to get an acknowledgement of basic rules of the road and diplomacy and international law is one thing. Javad Zarif, they have a peer. They have somebody who's written in Western journals about international law. And I think in some ways he has the ability to sort of say, listen, hey, we're all in the same community. I'm on your team. Don't personally disappoint me. And I think it makes him a very effective negotiator with somebody like John Kerry, who believes in his own powers that you can just change the world by spending enough time talking to somebody. But I think this time, Zarif clearly got the best of Kerry. And at least what we're seeing now with the details that both sides have shared, both sides are disputing, by the way. They don't agree on exactly what this thing means. At least it looks like, Zarif has done very well for the Islamic Republic of Iran.
I want to underline what you just said, because the Senate is watching. You and your colleague Josh Rogan have spoken to members of Congress, especially members of the Senate, and they are watching and waiting for what emerges from Switzerland, because the Senate wants to review this. There's a bill from Senator Corker of the Foreign Relations Committee to insist upon oversight. But oversight of what? As of tonight, last time I checked, the White House has one fact sheet. The EU has another fact sheet, and I understand Mr. Zarif is already challenging the White House. Is that correct, Eli?
Well, Zarif's version of this deal is that the UN, EU, and U.S. sanctions would effectively be lifted once the IAEA verified, like it has already in terms of this interim agreement, that Iran was meeting the terms of the deal. That is not the way that Kerry described these sanctions. He said that if Iran is seen to be cheating, it will be very easy to snap them back. But I think that the mechanism for how the sanctions are reimposed, particularly in what body, are they UN sanctions? Are they the U.S. sanctions? Which sanctions in the U.S. are we talking about? All of that is really yet to be determined. And Zarif believes that he's pretty much getting a promise for sanctions relief upon the first certification by the IAEA that Iran is in compliance. But here's the catch. Iran has to continue to be in compliance and adhere to the very strict kind of surprise inspections and all of the access it's promising over a course of 10, in some cases 20 years or 15 years, depending on the facility or the issue. Do you think the Iranians are not going to do the same thing that Saddam Hussein did? Saddam Hussein also agreed to the terms of a ceasefire under much more duress in 1991 that would require him to collaborate and cooperate with UN weapons inspectors. It took a dozen years and ultimately the 2003 Iraq War to resolve that issue. And by the way, Bill Clinton bombed Saddam Hussein twice in the 1990s as punishment for stalling and violating his agreements under this kind of similar kind of arms deal. So we're counting on the Iranians to keep their word now over the next 10, 15, 20 years. That's the bet, because it doesn't make sense in terms of all this wonderful monitoring and inspections unless, the Iranians say, okay, fine, you can come to the site, you can see this, we'll answer these questions. By the way, so far, they have done none of that. But that's where Javad Zarif comes in, because he's such a smoothie. He's like, what? We're not hiding anything. Of course we'll keep our word. Don't disappoint me on this.
Mr. Zarif then has already challenged the White House's interpretation of what was stated today in Switzerland and what the President of the United States presented to the American people. Mr. Zarif has already said that is not accurate. How did he put it diplomatically?
He said that in a tweet that the White House's fact sheets there was no need for such spin. But here's the thing, though. I don't believe anything Javad Zarif says. I mean, I've been going through, his public statements and his interviews, and he says absolutely ridiculous nonsense. And it's incredible what he gets away with. He tries to explain away the words of the Supreme Leader when he's obviously talking about his fervent wish to destroy Israel, which is, by the way, not interesting in the context of Iranian politics. But Javad Zarif will really say anything. So when he accuses the, Kerry and Obama of lying, there's a good chance this could be what psychologists call projection.
Eli, right now, the Senate is watching this, especially Senator Corker.
Yeah.
I'm presuming that they want to hear from our negotiators about Javad Zarif. I'm presuming they want to hear what the United States believes it's agreed to. Is that what Senator Corker's waiting to have a bill passed to insist upon in interviewing everybody who was in Switzerland?
The White House has promised, President Obama has promised, to brief the leaders of the Senate and the House on what's in this agreement, and we'll see if these briefings are more precise and specific than what they've done up to now. Which, I mean, there have been a lot of complaints that they haven't gotten a lot of the information on what these negotiating positions were. I would just say, though, that if the Senate wants to know about Javad Zarif, then I suggest they ask the FBI, because the FBI was investigating him for years when he was the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations in a case involving something called the Alawi Foundation, which was ostensibly a charity that was controlled by the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, worth hundreds of millions of dollars to support all kinds of things in the United States, effectively skirting U.S. sanctions and also trying to hide Iranian influence in that way. So, the FBI, I'm sure there's many notes that haven't made it to file about Javad Zarif.
A long file on Mohammad Javad Zarif, the man of the hour for Tehran and perhaps for Europe as well, but many more discoveries. Eli Lake, I'm John Batchelor.